From Wish TV and the All Indiana Podcast Network, this is the Business, Equity, and Opportunities Podcast with Scott Sander.
Welcome to the Business, Equity, and Opportunities Podcast. I'm Scott Sander. Today's pod is an exclusive extended edition with extra information and conversation beyond what you saw in our Sunday morning broadcast. For about 14 years, Tom Alvarez has been a regular contributor on Wish TV's style shows. Brings with him decades of experience. His journey, his success story, will inspire you.
Every business is unique and has a target audience. If you own or manage a business, Circulus Digital Media can help you connect and grow your customer base with turnkey digital solutions that are nimble, offering best-in-class results, service, and support to reach a bigger customer base, allowing you to pinpoint a specific audience down to the smallest details. Get outside the city, the state, span the globe. Put Circulus Digital Media to work for you. Get started now at circulusdigital.com. That's circulusdigital.com.
You are such a legend in this community, and I want to go back to get to know you better. I mean, I know some things, but I want the audience to get to know. So let's start way back when you first had the inclination that you wanted to be a part of broadcasting, because you really started in broadcasting, right? Talk to me about that.
Okay, it was Connie Chung, who was the former CBS anchor. It was she who planted the seed. It happened that I dropped out of IU Fort Wayne, Indiana University. I was a theater student. I was a terrible theater student. I'm not a terrible student. I loved the theater. I just didn't like anything but the theater classes. But anyway, for various reasons, I moved to Washington, D.C. to join a couple of brothers who were there on the GI Bill. They had been in Vietnam. They were Marines, are still Marines, and they encouraged me to come out and, be exposed to the big city and spend time with them. And so I went out there. I had a job already because I put myself through college as a bank teller. At one time, I considered banking as a career. So it was easy enough for me to get a banking job. So I worked in a branch of a major bank in DC on Wisconsin Avenue near Bethesda. Right across the street was a Washington, DC TV station. I can't remember the call letters. I'm sure they're still around. But I worked in the bank across the street, and one of our customers was Connie Chung. And she had been newly hired to work as Maury Povich's producer in a show called Panorama. She talks about all of that in her memoir that was published a couple years ago. Well, the young lady next to me, we became close friends. Her name was Terry. She was a young African American, and like me, we had so much in common. You know, we had dropped out of school. We didn't have any direction. Of course, I loved theater, but I knew that I didn't feel I had the talent to go on and become a professional actor, and I didn't want to teach. So I thought I was really taking a break when I dropped out. But she and I talked about a lot about our futures and direction, and Connie overheard us at one time talking about that, and she said, "Have you ever considered broadcasting?" She said, "Doors are opening for minorities. I represent the first wave," and look what happened to her. So I don't know, I just trusted that this woman knew a thing or two. She was very, very, very driven, and you could tell she was very ambitious. She said, "You might consider broadcasting," and I kind of tucked that away. So after a couple of years of living in Washington, various situations, financial most of all, I had to return back to Fort Wayne and live with my parents until I could kind of regroup and figure out what my next step was. And while I was there, I got involved with a Mexican-American organization, and I met a man named Jose Trevino, who's a very successful businessman, owned 5 Mexican restaurants, way ahead of his time. Very, very driven, ambitious, and he became a mentor. And one day, I was kind of discouraged about what do I do with my life. And he said, well, do you have any dreams of what you would like to do? And I said, well, there's an idea I have that was planted, and I explained what Connie had to say. He said, Tom, this is your lucky day. It just so happens I sit on an advisory committee for WRTV in Indianapolis. And they were they were purchased just a few years ago from Time Life magazine, or Time Live. It was a McGraw-Hill operation, McGraw-Hill Broadcasting. And Mexican-American groups in Bakersfield, they're stationed there, and in San Diego had filed a petition to deny. So before McGraw-Hill could take over ownership, they had to agree to programming and hiring of Latinos, or programming of interest to Latinos, or advocating Latinos. So because of what was happening in California, Indianapolis had to follow suit, which is, when you think about it, was remarkable, because we were not even close to that kind of climate here in Indiana. This is the early 70s. He said they're looking for a Latino on the air, not necessarily someone in the news department, and obviously you don't have that kind of experience, but there is a public affairs show, and they would like to have a Latino on the show. The host, his name was Russ Freeland. He had been a former ABA basketball player, big Indianapolis star. He said, I'm on this advisory committee, and I will alert them that that I've talked to you about this and you're interested, and we'll try to set up an interview. And you'll be interviewing with the general manager. His name was Jerry Chapman at the time. So it all happened really quickly. I got the interview, I showed up at his office, and it was a remarkable experience because, it was a half hour, and he didn't know a whole lot about me, but I remember him being just really kind and generous, and just really quite interested. You could tell it didn't seem like it was an obligatory thing, because he had to make these this minority advisory committee happy. It wasn't like that at all. He had a great generous spirit. So I think obviously we really hit it off. He said, well, you know what? Why don't we just send you down to the studio and you can audition for this position? It is a live show. It airs every Saturday. It's called Opportunity Knocks, and it's sponsored by the Indiana Employment Division. And what you would do is, I was kind of like an early Vanna White. The sets back then, it was a public fair show, and Channel 6 had like 5 or 6 of them. And they aired like at 6 a.m. in the morning, just, really the early hours, weekdays and so on and so forth, or weekends. And so I went down to the studio. I mean, this has all happened very quickly. I've never been on television in that capacity. When I was younger, I was a Boy Scout. My first TV experience was I was on the Bozo Show at WKJG in Fort Wayne when I was 9 years old. I just never forgot looking at myself on the monitor and thinking, I was like, the glamour of it all, the mystique of it all, it's just like I was so enamored with it. And I don't know, somehow I knew that I wanted that someday. And then obviously it was still my subconscious when Connie brought up the idea that I could make that a profession. Okay, so I went down, sat on their news set, and they brought in some copy, like a 30-second commercial for some local cleaners. And so I read this commercial. I did it in one take, and I felt pretty comfortable. I had theater background, so I had acting courses, and speech classes. Anyway, after that was over, I went back to Fort Wayne, and within a week they called me. We would like to offer you a talent position part-time. I think they paid me like $50 a show. Just like I was absolutely astounded. I'll just never forget that feeling. I just could not believe. And think about how ironic the fact that the show was called Opportunity Knocks. So, well, I decided that, you know, it would be easy enough to commute weekly. Well, not easy for me because I didn't have a car, I didn't have a whole lot of money, but I knew that I could probably, I would figure it out. But eventually I thought, you know what, I should just move there. And I'll do this thing, and then I'll get a part-time job, and then I'm going to work my way up. Somehow I'll get my foot in the door, and you know, I just need to get there. And so that's exactly what I did. I came to Indianapolis, and the first night I remember sleeping on the floor of someone's apartment, someone's kitchen floor, and they had kids, and it was a nightmare. I couldn't sleep. My first day was the next day to be on the air live in central Indiana. Their coverage area was huge, like your coverage area. It went well, that was all good, and then I went searching for housing, and I didn't really know anybody there except for a few friends of friends, and so I slept on some couches and floors, and then I went to the Hispanic Center at the time. It was a community organization. They came up with some emergency funds so that I could get an apartment. After doing that show for 3 or 4 months, I finally found my way to the control room. And that's when I realized, you know, talent's one thing, but that's not, you know, if I'm going to perform, I would rather be on the stage because that's my background. But it didn't have that much appeal to me, especially not in my situation, because you know, it was public affairs, and I don't think I realized at the time the exposure I was getting. It didn't register that way. So I walked into the control room one day, and all the monitors, and you know, I shadowed the director there for a while. He let me, like, you know, get a look at behind the scenes, and I was just so taken with the director's ability to do that multitasking and have like 15 people in the studio and back in the tape room, and how he coordinated all. It was like a conductor, and I thought, wow, I was just so amazed. But I thought to myself, I said, oh, there's no way I could do that. I mean, I mean, I have no experience. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to find a way to learn this, because I think this could well be my future in broadcasting. You know, to be a producer and a director. And as it turned out, I didn't know this until I got my foot in the door, that McGraw-Hill Broadcasting, also as part of the whole affirmative action deal they made, is that they would also train minorities, and young blacks and young African Americans. And remember, at this time, young people of color hadn't matriculated through broadcasting or broadcast telecommunications programs, so there wasn't a whole lot of movement, and they hadn't discovered it yet, or they weren't recruited, or they didn't feel welcome. But that was only beginning to happen, so the training was a way to overcome that disparity. And so I immediately signed up, and because I was already at the station, the capacity I was, you know, there's no question. So they accepted me, and I was paid a stipend, and they put me to work. And I was trained by, you know, my fellow producers at that time. They had like a staff of, like, it was a big staff. I mean, Channel 6 at the time, being a McGraw-Hill station, was very profitable. It was #1 for many years, all the time I was there. And so they sunk a lot of money into budgets and, you know, hiring people, the very best. So I trained, you know, with there were, I think, about 10 people. We had our own production department, and the producer directors, some of them just did news, others did sports, some did specials, and some of us, you know, public affairs for it. So we kind of split it up. We had an operations manager, David Goff, And so I began directing mostly public affairs programs, and I was assigned to sign up, and there was a farm show that went on the air. Harry Martin, legendary farming broadcaster. Harry had that show for, I think the station was the first in Indiana. In 1948 is when they went on the air. So I think he started it in the 50s. And so I directed his show for a while, and it's a great memory. He was just a great, nurturing, kind person. He would have people on like Future Farmers of America doing demonstrations, and I would remember one in particular where there was like a cutout of a cow, and they came on to demonstrate how to inseminate a cow, if you can imagine. But anyway, I learned the business by doing public affairs shows and doing shows like Harry's. And I also did the cut-ins at that time. The station was owned by, it was an NBC affiliate until ABC took over. They took over, they switched to ABC. So I did news cut-ins, and I did a lot of that kind of programming, public affairs. And then I started getting assigned to doing specials, like half-hour documentary format. And again, following the attempt to broaden the audience and people of color and minorities, issues of importance to African Americans and Latinos, women. They started, giving us, we get a list of programs that they wanted to touch upon topics. The director of public affairs, Judy Wall, the first black TV executive. She was on the committee, by the way. She was a former Christmas Addicts teacher, very well respected, but she made her way into broadcasting, and she became a VP, and that's top management. And I don't think people realize what a huge impact that she had on the industry. And another woman who served on that advisory committee, African American, Faye Williams, they became my mentors. There were a lot of politics involved. And like every business culture, there's politics. It comes with the territory. But they really had my back, and they made sure that there were the opportunities were spread around the staff that I got my shot. And so that they started signing me to do programming related to the black community and to the Latino community. And I did I've produced the very first documentary about Madam C.J. Walker. And that was, looking back, I was just, the other day I was at a book signing. Her great-granddaughter, Alelia Walker, just published her new book, Joy Goddess, about Madam Walker's daughter. And this is her second book. Her first one was Madam Walker, as you know. It later became a Netflix documentary. So I did others about migrant farm workers. And my parents were farm workers. They were migrants. And they would go back and forth between Texas to the Midwest. And finally, my mother, cut from her same cloth. She was quite a visionary, and talk about driven. She put her foot down and said, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to settle here. At the time, she said racism wasn't rampant. But in Texas, where they came from, it was. They suffered a lot of prejudice. And, they weren't educated, but they were hard workers. They had eventually 9 kids, and they wanted it was like the immigrant story, except they weren't separated from this country by an ocean. It was Texas. So they chose Fort Wayne to settle in because my mother, because he didn't speak or write English, she went out and found a job for him at a trailer factory, Fruhoff, and made out his application. So they hired him, and he was there for 30 years. And all of us were educated, Catholic grade schools and the same high school. We had a parish we lived in the industrial east side. So that's sort of a brief thumbnail sketch of my background. So I thought, doing the community stuff that I was doing, I had insights that at that time no one had. No one, absolutely no one had. And so I think that I did a lot of work which got a lot of attention at the time, a lot of press. And I think that's really when my name, and then, I had my name on the credits and everything. And, I'm very proud of the fact that my specials became profitable. The salespeople, I learned early on that you really want to get to know the salespeople because they'll promote you if you can make them money. And I always kept an eye on that, when I did my stuff. And they always aired in prime time. And I was always having someone knocking on my door and said, hey, I got this idea. And I said, well, I don't make the decision about the topics, but I can suggest them. But anyway, I went on to do a lot of that. I think when I left Channel 6, I had done about 25 documentary style shows. I even developed, a few people were doing docudramas. Because my theater department, my theater background, I was able to teach myself that format. And with the great photographer editors that I work with, we usually function as a team. The photog editor, the sound man, and me. And, I used local theater actors, and, we did a lot of recreations. That was way ahead of its time. And so by the time I left the station, I had a pretty rich, broad experience. But I knew that I could only go so far, and I really wasn't interested in being an executive. I wanted to be a creative. And so through a series of good fortune, I met the right people, and I ventured out and started a film and video production company. And it was a turnkey operation. It was called Alvarez Group. We were all young, and we were all very, again, ambitious and driven, and wanted to, make money. We came in at the right time because that's when VHS format changed the world. That format and VHS machines, they were becoming predominant in people's homes, hospitals, business. And I could see, I knew just by studying the marketplace nationally that, marketing was going to be the future of this new format. And I could tell locally that there was going to be a demand and the market was going to grow for hospitals and banks and businesses to do promotional videos. And not to mention, arts groups and education, everybody else, because now it's accessible and affordable, depending on who shot it. And then, production companies were springing up all over Indianapolis. I thought about the model that I wanted, and then I thought, I'll do a turnkey. I'll produce, and then I will, I'll hire freelance people in the production community, and I will edit at production houses, and I'll do my own sales, I do my own marketing, and that's what I did that for 10 years. It was really fraught with a lot of stress because, any entrepreneurship or activity is fraught with a lot of, it's good days and bad days. You're up and you're down, and cash flow is always a problem. But I would say I did pretty well, and at the end, I grabbed a government contract, and I made quite a bit of money off of that. But then I grew weary of production. I just decided that I wanted to branch out and broaden my skills and broaden my I always had my first love was the arts and theater. So, and I had started my sort of niche that I have now in the arts, because when I was in business, I did a lot of pro bono videos for arts groups around town. And that's really where I made my name. And I got an Artie Award one year as a business because everybody was asking me to shoot promotional videos for them. and I did it for free. And they would always promise, well, in return, we'll give you exposure. Well, that didn't really happen all that. Oh, we'll bring business your way. But, but it did establish me and gave me definitely increased, quote, my brand. I'm 77, so I think I left there when I was still in my late 30s and started doing other things. And, frankly, unless I had the bio in front of you, I've lost track of all the stuff that I've done. I've reinvented myself quite a few times. I feel like I've come full circle from that little Boy Cub Scout at WKJG. I'm now associated with Circle City Broadcasting and Channel 8. I've been, thanks to you, I have been a contributor, performing arts contributor on Lifestyle Live for, it'll be 12 years. And a year and a half ago, your director of creative services approached me and asked me if I would be interested in having a podcast. He said, we're using your content on Lifestyle Live anyway, so how would you feel about having your own show? And it's like, it felt like that day I was in my parents' kitchen and I got that phone call that I had gotten the talent gig in here at Channel 6. So
I want to leapfrog back just a little bit, because I want to take you back to when you and I first met, because I'm interested in knowing, we got together and we had a conversation much like we're having here, but from where you were then, what did you think about that, and how did you know that was going to be a good path to take you, get you back into television? You had left it to get you back into the idea of television. What was going on in your mind, and what made you make that decision?
Well, what's old is new again, Peggy, in the broadcasting business. Part of my training program, I was a gopher for the Jim Gerard show. He was like the Johnny Carson of Indianapolis. He had a show where he'd go out in the community with a mic, ahead of his time, really. At one time, he had a band. There was budgets when people flew in. Everyone went on Jim Gerard's show. I was his gopher. I met all the celebrities, all the people at the front door. I got coffee for them, and I got to know them before they went on, to talk to Jim, and afterwards too. And so, and they had cooking segments, and they touched in that hour, they touched on, just as you all do. It was a lifestyle show, travel, entertainment. And the viewers were homemakers, very similar to your demographic. So, and people loved it because it was local. But there were big names on that show too. I mean, I did that for, I don't know, about 5 years, and then Jim, went off the air. But so I had that experience of working with that show, and I saw what it did in terms of exposure for people. And so, when I was approached to do this, in that capacity, though, as a contributor, I mean, it was a marriage of all the things that I love, I could promote the arts, I could be back on, and this time it meant more to me to be on the air because I've grown so much, and obviously maturity, confidence, no one can take away your experience. I have a wealth of experience that I can bring to the fore in this capacity, being a broadcaster again. So that's what appealed to me. And I talk about this often, but there's a downside to, quote, putting yourself in public eye. I try not to think of the big picture of people's eyes on me or that kind of thing, because it would paralyze me. Even as a director, I never thought about who was out there, because it's like you're flying an airplane. You just want to land it safely. It has to be perfection, because that's not as dramatic. But in a way, broadcasting, those of us who are in broadcasting, the goal is perfection, is not to make it look effortless, but at the same time, you reach the masses of people that you reach. It's powerful, powerful, powerful. And I'm reminded of it all the time from my colleagues. when I left Channel 6, people could not believe that I would walk away from television. And that reminded me that how fortunate I was. Many want it, but few are chosen, especially in a larger market. And here I was this kid, and I landed in a top 25 market. That's not easy for anybody. But so when you brought that up, I remember you saying we're not in a position to pay you, but this will offer you some exposure. And of course, in the beginning, I thought, rolling my eyeballs, and I thought, no, she's exactly right. Peggy would know. She, in her capacity, at the time, you were executive producer, right? So I knew that this would be worth my while in spades. But I also was smart enough to know that it would also create open doors for my brand, and anything or everything that I was involved in, it would piggyback. And in the 12 years that I have been on, it's been extraordinary how that exposure has opened doors for me. People returning your phone calls, the influences brought me. Now I feel comfortable calling myself an influencer because I have credibility, which has been built up over years. But again, it has a lot to do with the fact that I am associated with a company of the stature. It's not some sort of, I'm not doing a podcast in my kitchen. So I rarely have people turn down an opportunity to work with me on any project that I'm involved in. And of course, now I have a production company that I've had for 10 years, successful. I wanted to keep my hand in being a creative. I'm also an actor, I'm a lyricist, I'm a theater producer. Klein and Alvarez Productions, my business partners, Dustin Klein. We're celebrating our 10th year, and that's, I think, is astounding. Two-man band, and we pick and choose what we want to do, and we have a very, very, very enviable donor list of big names who support us, but that all came as a result of my being, oh, by the way, along the way, I also started freelance writing. I first started with Nuvo, and then I got my start with Arts Indiana, doing theater criticism, and then Nuvo hired me right when they opened. Will Higgins was the managing editor, and later on, and I think he's still with the Indianapolis Star. And then along the way, I wrote for everybody in town. I even wrote occasionally for the Indianapolis Star when they did the arts and entertainment section. That's long gone, but they would also oftentimes put my features on artists on the front page. And but it's broadcasting that created this brand that I'm happy, to share, has, become synonymous. I like to think, people tell me that, that my stuff is of quality, and that means a lot to me in terms of, there's a lot of choices out there, and a lot of people have a lot of options about how they're entertained, how they're informed, and all that. And so if you can work your way throughout that and create a niche for yourself, and I believe that's part of my success. I have a niche that only I can pull off. Other people can do it, but not to the extent that I've been able to do it. So I think, since you're a business show, I think it's a good business story.
So if you ask kind of a personal question here, but if you could go back to that little boy who first saw himself on television and look him in the eye and say, I want you to remember one thing about this journey you're about to take, what would that be?
Well, I'm an open book, and I'm happy to share things about my childhood. So let me set that up, first of all. Okay, so I was a family of 9 of us, hardworking, strict, blue-collar people. I was raised biculturally, my Mexican-American heritage. My parents didn't teach us Spanish. because they were afraid that we would be discriminated against because of our accents. When they lived in Texas, they faced brutal discrimination from all sides. Not only whites, but blacks. I mean, they were like in the basement. And so they were very sensitive, and it was the whole American dream thing, assimilation. We want you to fit in. And I regret that to this day that I'm not fluent. Actually, within the last 5 years, I've moved to the West Side intentionally because I'm surrounded by Latino immigrants, and I am now learning Spanish. And so keep that all in mind, and as a child growing up. But I also, coming from a large family like that, there's also a lot that came with in terms of, the financial difficulties. My mother is a homemaker, 9 kids. We shared like a 4-bedroom house, a tract home, one of those national homes on the industrial side of Fort Wayne. But, we had great community support, and we had a lot of help early on, Catholic Charities and groups like that. And my mother had kind of personality that, she was like, she didn't know a stranger. She had a lot of pride. She taught us early on, you don't have to have money to have style or good taste. But she also taught us discipline, and as my father, they instilled in us a work ethic, that had a lot to do with where I am today. But, when I was a little boy, I knew down deep that I was different. And I knew, of course, I later came out. It took me, in college, I finally came out 20 years later. But of course, I knew that, and growing up Catholic, I said that whatever those feelings were, I had to submerge them and keep that secret. And fortunately, I wasn't bullied or anything like that, because I had a good sense of humor, and I had 6 brothers who had my back. And of course, I made friendships with neighborhood boys who also had my back. So I don't know, it's something about my personality that helped me avoid that kind of trauma. But I had my own traumas for different reasons. My father struggled with alcoholism, and so I grew up in that kind of environment, and of course the financial stress and all that. So when I chose theater as a way of studying, and I was the first in my family to go to college, by the way, because I knew that I was not, in the high school I went to, it never occurred to them to put me on a college track, and so they just assumed that I would end up working in a factory like my dad. So if I were to have looked into that camera, I would have said, just be patient, work hard, have faith in yourself, don't let anybody else ever define you or tell you what you can or cannot do. Trust your instinct. That's what I would have said. I don't know, somehow I knew all that, but to me it's like a miracle, considering that I didn't really have that direction. The only direction I had, that's not exactly true. Some of my older brothers were my role models, and still are. And so I had family, I would say. And over time, I've had very strong friendships. I have friendships that go back 50 years, back to high school and college. So, but yeah, it's a miracle to me that I became a TV director, because I was so shy and I was so timid. Very sensitive kid, it was a blessing and a curse. My father had, if there was any bullying going on, it would have been my dad. He meant well, but it was a cultural thing. In Latino culture, it's all about macho, machismo. You're not a man, you don't cry. Well, Latinos are emotional, actually, which is kind of ironic. But no, I mean, in the mainstream, men, you keep a stiff upper lip. You don't ever show your feelings. But that's why I found the arts. I found my peeps, because I could express that part of me. But again, by the time I got into broadcasting, somehow I found it in myself I was determined that I would find a way to express myself and overcome, some of those insecurities but I still have them. We all do. Adults, it's a struggle. For me, I've never overcome. Sometimes I think it's not good enough, but I'm harder on myself than others could ever be. What I'm learning in my old age is don't be afraid to be vulnerable. And I'm finding with the podcast, Peggy, is that my guests see that I'm vulnerable, and I tell on myself all the time, which gives them an opportunity to open up. And I think that I've learned that I'm becoming a really better listener, by the way, like you are, obviously. Because, if you listen carefully to someone, everyone has a story, and they will tell you if you ask them. This gives me something to focus on that distracts me. I don't want to be defined by my age or my physical condition. I just want to work and I want to contribute. And I believe, I like to think that I've been able to accomplish those goals.
Our thanks again to all the contributors who joined us for this episode of the Business Equity and Opportunities podcast. We hope you found it enlightening, useful, and inspiring. You'll find more information about the show on our website, beoshow.com. You can watch Business Equity and Opportunities Sunday mornings at 10 on Wish TV or live stream it through wishtv.com. Each week we provide 7 full segments with topics ranging from how to get started and how to access capital to the day-to-day running of your business and questions about accounting and bookkeeping. We feature business news and trends and always share a success story from one of our contributors. Join us next time for more insights into the world of small business. Be sure to sign up for our Business Equity and Opportunities newsletter to get even more valuable, up-to-date information. And if you have any questions or you'd like to be part of our show, please email us. The address is beo@wishtv.com. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Scott Sander. Thanks for listening.
Watch the Business Equity and Opportunity Show on Wish TV and access all of our content and share it on demand anytime at beoshow.com. You can find more podcasts from Wish TV on the All Indiana Podcast Network at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.